Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Complex Like Wine, the podcast where we talk about complicated things and improve over time, just like wine does. This episode's going to be very informational. I'm really excited. I have Mike joining us today, and we're going to talk about his experience living with a chronic mental illness. Like, if you can see, if you're watching either on Spotify or YouTube, you can see our kind of pictures because we're over Zoom right now, and he has his own podcast. So, thank you for joining, Mike.
Thanks, Ira, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so before we dive into it, we have our drinks. They're non alcoholic, but I am having a chai tea. And what are you having, Mike?
I am having a big red soda.
Very nice. So, yeah, how are you doing today? How's everything?
I'm good. Things are good here. How's things in your neck of the woods?
We're doing pretty good over here. The weather's finally getting warmer, so it's going to be nice to just be outside today.
Wonderful.
So, all right, people listening. So, Mike reached out to me because he wanted to share his experience with living with a chronic mental illness. And Mike, do you kind of just want to introduce, your background, what we want to talk about today?
Sure. I have a podcast, but what really I'm here to do is just kind of share some of my experiences with schizoaffective disorder, which is kind of an offshoot of schizophrenia. And with schizoaffective disorder, it is different, as in all the chronic and serious mental illnesses, they're all a little different. There's a couple of different schizophrenia type illnesses. I think there's schizoaffective, schizophreniform, and schizotypal. Those are the ones that come to mind off the top of my head. But with schizophrenia, um, that is a situation where 80% of the people who have it have hallucinations, as in hearing voices or seeing things. Um, with that, they also have delusions. And I have delusions. I do not hear or see things. And the additional component of schizoaffective is they also have depression. So I have depression as well. Um, Backing up just a little bit, with schizophrenia, they have positive symptoms, which are the hallucinations and the delusions and some confused thinking. With the negative symptoms, all under the same umbrella of schizophrenia, there are uh, the main thing that sticks out to me is a condition called anhedonia, which is um, where you lack interest in activities, and some may be thinking with that sounds like depression. Well, that's something that some people who have schizoaffective disorder clearly have depression, but anhedonia, one of the negative schizophrenia symptoms, is unique to schizophrenia typically, and maybe some of the other serious mental illnesses. So the difference between, in a nutshell, schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder is you either have a unipolar depression or a bipolar depression added to it. Unipolar being like major depressive disorder, and bipolar being like bipolar disorder. So it's schizophrenia plus depression or schizophrenia plus bipolar disorder. And uh, feel free to interact with me on this because I don't know what you'd want me to. I can get into this pretty deeply.
Yeah, I decided after undergrad that I wanted to switch my master's to psychology. And last year I was taking some psychology courses for prereqs for grad school. And one of the classes I took was abnormal psychology. And so one of the weeks and chapters we were going over was schizophrenia. And this was the first time I had ever heard of schizoaffective disorder. So it was really interesting, one, to learn about this because I had no idea, but then two, to just like see the differences in between. And like you said, schizophrenia is going to deal more with like the hallucinations and hearing and all that, versus schizoaffective is different. It's more like a, from what I understood in class, it's more of a loss, like a, you lose touch with reality, or like you disassociate with the reality, versus schizophrenia is kind of more the hallucinations and all that, where you're losing like actual perspective of reality. Would you say that's kind of correct?
Well, actually, they're the same thing. I should say it like that. Schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder both contain uh, basically schizophrenia. The addition is with schizoaffective, you have a mood disorder or bipolar disorder.
Got it.
So it is the same with the loss of reality and sort of like the alternate realities, I might say, compared to a neurotypical person.
Got it. Okay. Well, I want to learn more about your experience and your symptoms. So I would love to hear kind of just from the beginning of when you first started noticing this, how, did you seek treatment, or how did that come about with the diagnosis? And just kind of want to just hear from the beginning.
Sure. Now I can back up all the way to childhood, so I'll do that because some people like to know, um, what was a person's childhood like.
Right. And before you say it, because I know for schizophrenia, it's mostly apparent in males, and most people get diagnosed or start inhibiting symptoms when they're older. So, what was for you? Would you say? Well, I mean, you're about to explain to me anyway, but was that like a lot sooner than typical?
Sure. I think with males, it's 18 to 25 that they typically start getting a diagnosable schizophrenia condition. And with females, it can go up from uh, 18 to 30, I believe. Females are a little bit older to be diagnosed with that condition or an offshoot of it, like the schizoaffective. Um, yeah, that kind of thing. Uh, uh, and I could jump in with anything else. Is there another question in before I mean I just want to interact.
No, I think you're good to go. Yeah, you start from childhood.
Okay. So for me, I was kind of a loner as a kid. I and some loners, it wasn't my case. I was bullied a little bit. And I remember that took place all the way from excuse me, from elementary school up until a few years into high school. I remember times in short um, where I uh, had a bully waiting for me before or after school to get into a fight, and then there were even a couple of times when there was a fight in school, and I just don't think I ever really had the social wherewithal at that time, especially to navigate being a child, being a young adult, being a teenager. So I think that could have a bearing. We talk a lot about in mental health, as you know, trauma and even trauma informed therapy, which is something we could talk about too. But the trauma of something like that could have a bearing on the serious diagnoses such as bipolar, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, major depressive disorder. I don't doubt that's possible. And I think a lot of research is showing some of that today. But that was my extent of my trauma for the most part was we kind of had a situation where um, we were on lower on the socioeconomic status in those days, and I don't think my parents had the resources to get me the kind of help to not be such a loner. Not that being a loner is bad, but to jump out of your shell a little sooner in life. They didn't really have the resources to say, okay, maybe something's not quite right here, or maybe we just have a unique child on our hands. Um, they just didn't have the ability in those days to do something like that. So moving into navigating my teenage years, I didn't really do great in school. I graduated high school. I didn't do real great. I probably just barely got through to some extent. but I enjoyed school because it took my attention away from the things that were happening with other kids. I was afraid of kids. Not everyone. I actually had friends at different intervals that I would consider friends still today, even that we uh, talk with and such. But um, I would say I was a likable guy, but I just didn't have the social skills, which that's something with schizophrenia and a lot of the major mental illnesses that we need to be retrained or trained better on as adults. And we talk about rehabilitation. So I didn't really have that, but I had my first um, sign of serious mental illness when I was in my early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
I believe I was 24. And I had a psychotic break. And what that entailed for me was that I did lose touch with reality. I thought that uh, the government was watching me. I felt very suspicious of other people, and I started to um, read into. This is kind of an interesting thing because I not really heard this too much, but I started to read into numbers and even on my CDs. We had CDs back then. But I would look at the songs on a given CD and I would try to rearrange them and create sort of like a um just like the ultimate listening experience. I know it may sound a little funny, but I just like, oh, I can make this sound really good. I take this track out, put this track, basically creating a playlist. But the numbers started really getting to me. Um, I broke psychotic. They call it psychotic breaking. They call it breaking. I broke when things like that got out of hand for like a neurotypical situation. Again, I thought people were watching me, um, the government especially, and that they were out to get me. This is just like a general sort of like, well, it's a delusion, and I have those still today. Well, this is pre-medication for me, and um, there since I had never been on any psych meds ever at this time, uh, it just became clear things were just not right with me. What led up to this series of delusions for me was um, sleep, a lack of sleep. I wasn't sleeping well the days leading up to when I broke. Uh, so you could take like what some people have called a perfect storm of events, a lack of sleep, um, suspicious, being suspicious of other people or the government, and um, any sort of like delusion that is just far out there to the neurotypical person, to the normal type person. And that was me in that first psychotic break. Um, I went into other psychotic breaks down the road, but that was my first sort of indicate. That's when we first kind of know. Okay, say because they put me in the hospital, and we kind of sort of learned that okay, something's going on here. And back to you, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, now if you can share when you got the diagnosis and all that, how was that for you mentally? Were you kind of relieved because now you knew what was going on and you knew how to go about treating it, or was it difficult for you?
That's a great question. I actually, this is kind of some good backstory too to add to that story I've already told. Um, and in answering your question, I said, okay, once I got out of the hospital, I went in another time. But once I got out of those two stays, after those two psychotic breaks, which happened within a few months of each other, I said, I'm putting all this behind me. Whatever just happened is not going to happen again. If it, I mean, it's just I was in denial of it. So
Mm-hmm.
I went to college and I studied psychology, interestingly enough. And I took that probably that same abnormal psych class that you did.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to answer your question, I had to have more psychotic breaks before they would give me the schizophrenia or schizoaffective diagnosis label. They want to watch you in a clinical setting because they don't just typically, I mean, they really don't just say, oh, this person has schizophrenia. It is a serious diagnosis, and they got to have some time in a clinical setting observing you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And so I had like about five psychotic breaks in about a 3 or 4 year period of time. And what I found out was each diagnosis they gave me was a stepping stone to the next. They did not have an accurate diagnosis for me until we got through that like fourth or fifth psychotic break. And they told me along the way, well, we think you have major depressive disorder. Now we think you have bipolar disorder. You might have schizophrenia. We we don't know about that yet, but we think it's possible you have something called schizoaffective disorder. Of course, I didn't know what most of that stuff meant. I knew bipolar disorder a little bit, understanding of that. That's kind of a common sort of like people hear about that. Um, but they gave me the schizoaffective disorder label ultimately, and I by the time it got there, I was so exhausted with all the with all the hospitalizations and all of the diagnose changes, and it's very common to have this happen. By the way, when you're in the serious mental illness realm, to have diagnoses change a lot as you're admitted to the hospital more and more times. So when it finally came down to the moment that my psychiatrist in an outpatient setting said that I had schizoaffective disorder, I'm like, well, what do we got to do to fix it?
Mm-hmm.
That's what I told him. I had, I was in my last year of college, and I had spent the entire summer in the hospital. So how I felt, and it was off and on going into the hospital. So how I felt was relieved, but also I, I was not well. They had to give me injections in my buttocks. They had because I wouldn't take medication, and I
Mm.
kept on going in and out of the hospital. So they you got to take these meds. Um, so ultimately, in that last year of college, I called my father and said, from school, and I said, because I wasn't taking my meds, I said I can't not take these meds anymore. I cannot go through this experience any longer without some help. I said I didn't want to take medication, but I knew somewhere inside me that the way I was going without these meds is just me personally. I would not have lasted very long. Um, there would have been a lot of things that were undesirable happening to me because no medication. So we went to the doctor, got some medication, and that's when they told me about schizoaffective and that this is what I was dealing with.
Well, thank you for sharing. Yeah. How was your family when you shared them the news with your diagnosis?
Um, and this is something that I've learned is has been like a very helpful thing. They were supportive. Um, I grew up in a family that didn't really like to take medication for
Mm-hmm.
anything. They didn't like to take Tylenol, ibuprofen, any of that stuff. And so when they saw how I was, what I was going through, it changed their whole perspective on this stuff. It changed. It was like a 180, and um, um, so I had the support of my family, and my parents were religious, spiritual Christians. Uh, and I was struggling with that because I'll just take a sidetrack here, but a lot of people with schizophrenia type disorders have religious delusions, and I did have those.
Mm,
And a lot of people think they're God. A lot of people think they're the devil. And this is during a psychotic episode, typically
mm-hmm.
when they're not being medicated most of the time. So I had the support of my family, but it was tough. That's a tough diagnosis to get at. I think I was 27 when I got the schizoaffective diagnosis, and they they supported me, and there was a lot to sift through. Um, when I got that diagnosis, I had one semester of college left, and I had to finish that at home. I was not consistent in going to classes. It was really once I got on those meds, I got to share that. Um, I didn't have, and I had spent the whole summer in the hospital and off and on meds. But once I started taking the meds full time, it did create um, a lot of issues for me with motivation. And I don't know, I shouldn't say that. The meds didn't create the issue, the illness created the issue. The meds have side effects that are difficult to tolerate. And a lot of us have heard about that about psych meds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the meds have side effects in a lot of cases that are difficult to tolerate. So that was my new journey is at that time was find a medication whose side effects I can tolerate and a medication that's going to work to treat my schizoaffective slash schizophrenia type diagnosis. So, all in all, in the past 15 years, I have been on 6 different antipsychotics in that
Mm,
whole quest to try to find something that I can do well with. And I'm also take a mood stabilizer and an antidepressant because with the schizoaffective, you have a mood disorder or bipolar.
mm-hmm.
So I had to start a second antipsychotic about 2 to 3 months ago. So I'm on 2 antipsychotics, a mood stabilizer, and an antidepressant. And I have not been one of the 10 to 15% of people out there who seem to have everything controlled very, very well. I'm not. There's only 10 to 15% uh, out there people whose serious mental illness, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia is being controlled very well with medication. I am one of the lucky ones. I will say that. I have a lot of, um, I do well for the most part, but well is a spectrum, just like mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Um, People say, oh, I can't believe you have schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And I'm like, I don't really share it overtly with everyone, but I will say in some, I do well with it. But at the same time, um, there's a lot of things that keep me from being anywhere close to a neurotypical. And I think your audience probably knows what a neurotypical is at this point.
Yeah, for in case people that don't, neurotypical are people that aren't dealing with some type of mental illness or difficulty, like people that, are dealing with, autism or mental disorders or even like schizophrenia, schizophrenic, that would be not neurotypical.
100%. Yeah.
Because whether it's, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, or people that have anxiety, depression, bipolar, like anything where they're taking some type of medication, there is a curve, a learning curve of figuring out what works best for you because every body is different. And yeah, can you kind of share how, like, the medications that you took and now the ones you are, like, the side effects and how it's just whether it's helped you or kind of made things difficult for you. Because I know some people can have a really difficult time when they're trying medication and trying to find the right fit. And, some people might get really discouraged on trying to continue exploring that because the effects can affect them so badly.
That's the thing. You're 100% right. You know, we hear that all the time. And when you study this stuff and live this stuff, you're sometimes the subject of it. With schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, even bipolar, even major depressive disorder, it's a challenge. But being on medication for me has given me somewhat of a life. The fact that I'm sitting here today sharing my story in a coherent, sort of cohesive fashion, that's not everybody with my diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
They are just not able to do that. And so over the years, I've learned to acclimate myself as much as I can to what people do say and expect, so to speak. Um, but it is something that has the medication have medication has side effects that are difficult to tolerate at times. But I know how I was without the medication, and I know that a lot of people swear against it. But and this is just a tiny point to make, but look at all the people who have diabetes. They take medication, and if they don't, something could tragically happen to them. I kind of look at psych meds like that, and I catch fire sometimes for making that sort of comparison. But that's where I learned it from was my psychiatrist and other psychiatrists. They're like, hey, if you have a mental health condition and it requires medication, you take the medication just like a diabetic would take the meds.
Right, because it's there to help you. And I maybe if you tell me if you relate, but growing up in a Christian or religious household, at least in my experience, not specifically with my family, but just in general, the environment I was in, needing to go to therapy or needing to take medication or getting assistance like that was kind of more taboo because it's more like, oh, pray about it, like go to the church for it or whatever. And I and so I'm glad people like you and some past guests in the podcast have shared their experience with, taking medication or anything to kind of take away the stigma because I definitely for myself, when I was dealing with severe depression anxiety, I never took medication because there was that stigma in my head. But it's a tool that's there for you that can help. And so why would you not try to, see a way where it can help you?
I agree. The stigma is really something that each of us who have any sort of relationship with mental health that we talk about is something we have to deal with and tackle because it just it is something that requires us to be on top of. I know that with my illness, there's a lot of stigma. I know with bipolar, major depressive disorder, all of those serious illnesses. I don't know too much about anxiety and casual depression. That's probably not the right word. All depression is bad. All mental illness is bad. But I know with some of the lighter diagnoses, I really don't know what the stigma is like. But stigma is something we all have to fight.
Mm-hmm. So now I would love to hear more about, okay, you've now taken your medication, you've now adjusted, and now you've been able to figure out how to help your symptoms and your diagnosis. When we had first talked before recording, you shared that you have a partner and everything. So I'm just kind of curious, like now the day to day, how does that affect your partner? How does that affect your relationship, or even not the romantic ones, but just like your day to day life?
Absolutely. I rely heavily on my partner for support, mental and emotional support. And because I do that, I've been told that it's kind of difficult at times to give me that support.
Mm.
because I do rely on it in kind of a big way. It's kind of like I'm not actively in therapy, but she's like my therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So what I've learned to do is look at the friends in my life, the people in my life who've shown me over the years, hey, we're friends here. It's okay. That kind of a safe environment type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I go to them not for mental health support, but sometimes just to distract myself, just um to break up some of my symptoms because I shared about the six antipsychotics. Antipsychotics are important for the psychotic illnesses, but they don't treat every symptom. And anyone who has this diagnosis probably knows that if they have heavy delusions or if they have anhedonia, for instance, which is you lose interest in things, you have a lack of interest, that it's quite possible if you have a real hardcore um, instance of those types of symptoms, you're going to have symptoms that are not being treated. And so, since I never heard voices, I have the delusions and the lack of interest in things, and I have confusion. And this is a day to day thing for me. And sometimes I have suicidal thoughts. Now, for me, suicidal thinking um, is not anything I intend on acting on. They're invasive thoughts,
Mm-hmm.
but boy, do they get invasive. And so I look at my support system. Again, not everyone's giving me mental health help, so to speak, but just having them in my life, could be a family member, a friend, a neighbor, an acquaintance, has been helpful. Now, because I still have delusions that are very heavy for me, and because I get confused and um, have a difficult time getting interested in things um, at will, like at the snap of a finger. It's difficult for me to hold down employment. So that was kind of the reason for the podcast was that I've got to do something to give back. I want to give back. And again, to quote a statistic, only 10 to 15% of people have a part or full time job with this illness, but most of us want to work. So it's not like we just give up. And but with my symptoms, they do I do have them every day. Not the suicidal thoughts every day, but with this additional second antipsychotic, I've been told by my wife she feels that the delusions and the suicidal thinking have gotten a little bit better, and that's in spite of this last past week me having heavy suicidal thinking. So I'm like, okay, you're observing me, so I take your word at it because I wasn't sure if that second drug was helping.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I have a quote that I run across, and you're familiar with the Serenity Prayer, Zaira?
I don't think so, but I would love to hear it.
Okay, let me see if I can paraphrase it. Um, I didn't have that part. My quote is when you find no solution to a problem, it's probably not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be accepted, which is similar to the Serenity Prayer, which now I'm thinking of it. Uh, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can change, or to accept the things I cannot change, um, to accept the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So my
Mm-hmm.
quote in the Serenity Prayer kind of saying, hey, like when I was in my psychiatrist's office saying, how do we fix it? I can't fix this issue. And my medication cannot medicate me fully. And I have symptoms every day. I'm not one of the lucky 10 to 15% who didn't have heavy, heavy symptoms in those areas. And therefore, the medication, you know, was what wasn't able to help them, or what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But my day to day, I have hobbies, but I haven't had much interest in them for the past month. Um, I'll let you chime in if you have any some more things you want me to tackle in this area.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, yeah, thank you for sharing so much. It's just I've been just here listening and getting a really better understanding of everything, and so yeah, I appreciate you reaching out, wanting to be on the podcast and share. Um, I would love to kind of hear, how you met your wife and how, that relationship started, because I know for people that are dealing with a mental illness, finding a romantic partner, I think, can be scary or intimidating. And, hoping to meet somebody that's going to be understanding and patient to, work with them through that. So I'm just really curious to see how you and your wife got to be.
Well, with my that's a great question, and with my um somewhat difficulty with religion that I've decided at this time I'm not engaging in. But I will say this: I will engage to this degree. She's been a godsend. Um, I wasn't able to date. We rewinding back to when I talked about social skills training. I got through college, but that doesn't mean that I didn't have trouble at times socially, and all through times leading up to then. So I have a friend who I've been friends with for 30 years. And he said, and together we decided, I talked to him and I'm like, hey, I want to get out there and meet somebody. And I knew I wasn't able to do that without any sort of intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And he took me under his wing and just said, he says, I have clientele that he knew on somewhat of a personal level. He's a business owner. And he said, these people, some of them are not really good people, but they have partners. I don't know what their relationship is like, et cetera, et cetera. But you're a decent guy. You're an all right guy. You could do the same. And that was probably the catalyst that said, hey, a lot of us who are dealing with these illnesses want companionship. And being alone is so difficult on our symptoms. It's just really tough. So, again, I'm talking about people who's not being helped 100% with the medication the way it's intended to help them.
Mm-hmm.
So, long story short, we had several phone calls, and I would prepare for the phone calls and ask questions. And he had a wife and two kids and seems to be happy. So, long story short, I went on an online dating site. If you're curious, it's Match.
Mm-hmm.
And I met my now wife, who it turns out she was a former mental health nurse, which she did for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, if I can get through the door on that, because she's seen the worst of the worst, if I can make it to getting a date with someone like her, I mean, coming from the perspective that I wasn't really in, able to date or interested or probably wouldn't have been successful prior to all this.
Mm-hmm.
If I could get her who's seen 10 years of all this bad mental health stuff, man, I've made some strides with a lot of help along the way. So we met, dated a couple of years, and we're actually married. And we just have done the sorts of things that a lot of people do. But that's the thing that kind of gets me working philosophically. I shared a little bit of this with you. Um, People like us are kind of like throwaway in society. 30% of the homeless people have schizophrenia or an offshoot of it. They're
Mm-hmm.
talking to themselves. Now, there's also a co occurring diagnosis of substance abuse for a lot of these people. But a lot of us are homeless in the sense that some of us never had the support systems to stay in a home or in an apartment, and they became homeless. Some are in the hospital every 6 months to 2 years. Some are in and out of jail, and um, I guess I'm losing my train of thought.
It's just difficult overall.
It is.
Hmm.
It's difficult. Like I said, it's a day to day thing. I sometimes will read a story of someone that says, "Hey, I'm taking meds and they're helping me, and I don't have any symptoms." And I'm like, I for a while there in the early days of me reading that stuff, I'm like, I think this is a joke. I don't think this is real. I don't believe it. I think they're putting this on. But then the more I became involved in learning about other people's stories in this realm, I realized there's a small percentage, it is rare, of people whose medication just works, 100% works. And it works for me because I will share this too. I've been out of the hospital for over 20 years, 22 years to be exact.
And congrats.
Thank you. And I attribute that to all of the things I've been talking about here today. So, um, yeah. So that's some more of information for you.
So, for people listening that are dealing with schizophrenia or schizoaffective, or maybe someone that knows somebody that is struggling with it, what are some things you would like to share with them? If maybe, they're struggling with taking their medication or the day to day relating socially that they're having a difficult time, or, when they're going through a psychotic break and trying to make it over the hump, so to say. Like, what are some things you would love to share with them?
Sure. First off, I would say have grace with yourself. Um, it can be extremely difficult to know much of anything during an acute episode, a psychotic episode, but it seems to come in again and again and again that don't take drugs, don't drink, don't use substances, especially hard drugs, uh, hallucinogens. There's a thing called, I'll be brief here, but there's a thing called drug induced psychosis, and hallucinogens and some hard drugs seem to be the thing that can cause, for some people, prolonged use of these substances can cause these illnesses.
Mm.
It's a terrible thing to have to live with, but some things I could say is um, just if you can learn to trust your provider, because at some point you get a psychiatrist standing in front of you because you're in the hospital, because people around you are noticing your odd behavior, you're hearing voices, you're thinking that the government is out to get you, somebody from the CIA is spying against you, on you, or your God or the devil. Something's going on in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point, when you get in inundated into getting help for these things, at some point, learn to trust your providers. Learn to understand that people aren't doing this as it's just a job. They want to help people. You know as well as I do, it's a helping profession. Um, so you got to learn to trust your providers. That's not to say that as you get moving along with your diagnosis, when you get one that is accurate and so on, that you won't have opportunities to have other providers, like maybe you'll start counseling, uh, or you'll have some kind of other mental health professional that you're seeing. But the main thing is to learn to trust the providers. I think that that's kind of the thing that a lot of people struggle with, because if you can't trust who's trying to help you, then how will you ever do the things you need to do to get better?
Yeah.
I guess if I were just to narrow it down to one thing, that would be it.
Yeah. I think that's a really great advice. And again, it takes that vulnerability to put that trust. But, if you don't try, you're already like, what else can you lose? Because already you're not getting the help you need. So it doesn't hurt just to try to allow somebody to step in and give some assistance.
And it's so hard with the psychotic disorders, which schizophrenia type disorders, because man, look at all what's going on with that person. Um, I want to share a quote that I came across a while back. It's by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was, a very prolific writer in his day and one of the best of all time. But he said, "The purpose of life is not to be happy; it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well." And I guess I share that because it's a really powerful quote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. Um,
No, thank you. Yeah, that quote was beautiful.
yeah, I agree. I just wanted to let your audience have a hold of that a little bit. So,
Yeah. As we're kind of wrapping up here, I kind of want to go over more with your podcast and you do some episodes or quick little episodes where it's like an affirmation for the day and all that, and just kind of how's it been for you to do your own podcast? Because I know when I started doing this, it's been very cathartic for me and cathartic for the guests. So I'm sure for you, having episodes where that affirmations or just daily thoughts or sharing quotes, it must feel kind of therapeutic in a way to um, be able to put content out like that.
yes. And by the way, something about your podcast really draws me in. I'm not a big podcast listener, interestingly enough, but I really enjoy the guests you have on and the back and forth that you have. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mhm. So for me, it has been cathartic. I feel like my some of my thing is to share what has worked for me, to share what is working, and kind of sort of just have the whole experience, as you said, be cathartic and just put myself out there a little bit, be vulnerable, and kind of let everybody know that every day is a second chance. Um, but with the podcast, it's something I'll be completely straightforward. Because of my illness, I sometimes um, struggle with it with aspects of the podcast, and I won't go into too much detail about that. But you're never totally free of everything unless you're just not experiencing a lot of symptoms and things of that accord. But the podcast has been very helpful, and I've got like 30 some episodes, and I haven't interviewed anyone yet, but I'm hoping to do that, and hoping that you'll come on the show, and maybe we can start that trend and see how that goes.
Oh, absolutely. You tell me when. Yeah, I would love that.
Wonderful, wonderful. That sounds great.
Well, yeah, Mike, thank you so much for sharing everything. I really appreciate that you reached out and just sharing your story. And, I know this is definitely going to help somebody that's going through a similar situation. So, yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. I appreciate you having me on.
Cool. Well, guys, again, thanks for listening to this week's episode. I'm going to put Mike's podcast link in the bio. That way you can check it out. It's really nice, especially if you have kind of like a quick drive or have 5 to 10 minutes. Some really good affirmations and just little positive ways to start your day. And if you haven't already, if you're whatever platform you're on, subscribe, rate it, like it, share it with a friend. Maybe if you or somebody would like to share your story in regards to wellness and mental health, I would love to have you on. So again, thanks for everyone that's been so supportive. I appreciate all of you, and we'll see you on the next one. All right, bye guys.